There are moments in history when the world is so certain about something that the certainty itself becomes the danger. Not malice, not stupidity, not even carelessness in the ordinary sense. Just the particular blindness that comes from being right so many times in a row that the possibility of being wrong stops feeling real. The Titanic disaster was not born on the night of the 14th of April, 1912. It was born years earlier, in the offices of the White Star Line and the shipyards of Belfast, in the meetings of engineers and executives who looked at what they were building and concluded, with every reasonable tool available to them, that they had finally built something that the ocean could not defeat. Understanding why they believed that, understanding how a group of intelligent, experienced, professionally accomplished people arrived at a conviction that would kill 1,517 human beings is the only honest place to begin this story. The world of 1,910 was not the world of a century before it. The Industrial Revolution had not just changed what people could make. It had changed what people believed was possible, and the change was grounded in genuine evidence. In the space of a single human lifetime, the technologies of everyday life had been transformed beyond anything previous generations could have predicted. Steam power had replaced sail. Steel had replaced wood and iron. The telegraph had collapsed the distances between continents to the speed of an electrical signal. Surgical anesthesia had made medicine something other than organized agony. Vaccines had begun to eliminate diseases that had killed children by the millions for thousands of years. The people who lived through these changes did not experience them as isolated improvements. They experienced them as a pattern, as proof that human intelligence applied to natural problems could, given enough time and enough resources, solve those problems permanently. The faith in progress that characterized the Edwardian era was not naive. It was evidence-based. It had simply not yet encountered the specific category of evidence that would complicate it. The White Star Line's decision to build 3 Olympic-class ocean liners, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic, was made in the context of a fierce commercial competition with the Cunard Line for dominance of the North Atlantic passenger trade, where Cunard had chosen to compete on speed, building ships that were faster than anything White Star operated. White Star chose to compete on scale and luxury ships, so large and so comprehensively appointed that the experience of crossing the Atlantic on them would be qualitatively different from anything that had come before. The Titanic, at 882 feet long and 46,328 gross tons, was the largest moving object that human beings had ever built. The scale of the engineering achievement it represented was real, and was recognized as real by everyone who understood what had gone into building it. The watertight compartment system, 16 compartments sealed by electrically operated doors that could be closed from the bridge in seconds, was genuinely advanced for its time. The ship could float with any 2 compartments flooded, or with the first 4 flooded simultaneously. These were real safety features. They were simply not the safety features that the specific geometry of the iceberg damage required. The phrase, practically unsinkable, which has followed the ship through history like an accusation, was used at the time in a more qualified and more technically specific way than subsequent memory has preserved. The qualification matters, but it does not entirely change the picture. The culture surrounding the Titanic's construction and launch was one of confidence that had crossed the line from justified into absolute, a confidence in which the question of what would happen if the safety systems failed was one, not being asked with sufficient seriousness, because the people who should have been asking it had already, at some level, answered it in their own minds. That answer was that the systems would not fail. They were too good. The engineering was too careful. The era was too advanced for this particular category of catastrophe to remain possible. This was not a lie. It was something more dangerous, a sincere belief in something that was not true, held by people who had every professional credential to be taken seriously when they expressed it. On the morning of the 10th of April, 1912, the Titanic left Southampton with 2,224 people aboard, and a reputation that had preceded it across 2 continents. The passengers who walked up the gangways that morning were not a random sample of the population. They were a cross-section of a specific historical moment, the height of a particular kind of Western confidence, the last spring before the war that would end the world those passengers had been born into. In the first-class suites, people whose names appeared regularly in the society pages of London and New York newspapers arranged their luggage in rooms that were, by any fair comparison, more luxurious than the homes most people in the world would ever inhabit. 4 decks below them, in the third-class berths toward the bow and stern of the ship, immigrants from a dozen countries settled into spaces that were modest but functional, carrying whatever they owned in the bags they had brought aboard, heading toward a country that most of them had never seen, and that represented for each of them a specific and personal version of a better future. The ship that contained all of them, the wealthiest and the poorest, the most powerful and the most invisible, moved out of Southampton water and into the English Channel and turned its bow toward the west. It was moving at speed. The night ahead was clear and cold and moonless. And somewhere in the darkness, 4 days ahead of it, the North Atlantic was assembling the specific circumstances that all of that confidence had never quite accounted for. The ship sailed. The confidence sailed with it. And in the offices of the White Star Line, in the British Board of Trade, in the regulations that governed how many lifeboats a ship of that size was required to carry, the specific gaps between what had been promised and what had actually been built were waiting, quietly, for the moment when they would matter. The lookout, Frederick Fleet, spotted the iceberg at 11:39 p.m. and rang the crow's nest bell 3 times, the signal for something dead ahead, and telephoned the bridge with a report that has been quoted so many times it has acquired the quality of legend. The officer on watch ordered the helm hard to starboard, and the engines reversed. The ship began to turn. It was not enough, and it was not fast enough, and at 11:40 p.m., the starboard side of the Titanic scraped along an underwater shelf of ice that opened a series of punctures across the first 5 watertight compartments below the waterline. The contact lasted approximately 10 seconds. It was quiet enough that many passengers sleeping in their cabins did not wake up. It was consequential enough that the ship was, from that moment, going to sink. The only questions remaining were how long it would take, how many people would get off before it did, and how honestly the world would ever be told what had actually happened, and why. The iceberg warnings had been arriving at the Titanic's bridge throughout the day of April 14 with a regularity that should have produced a different response than the one it produced. At least 6 separate warnings from other ships in the area reported ice in the waters. The Titanic was crossing the kind of information that, in a culture of shipping that genuinely prioritized safety over schedule, would have produced a reduction in speed and an increase in caution as the ship entered the known danger zone. The culture of North Atlantic shipping in 1912 did not genuinely prioritize safety over schedule, and the evidence for this is not complex. It is simply the record of what captains routinely did with ice warnings in the years before the Titanic, which was to acknowledge them and maintain speed, and the record of what happened when they did, which was that the ships generally arrived safely because the iceberg they might have hit happened to be somewhere other than the exact point where they were. The culture had been reinforced by decades of this outcome. Captain Edward Smith, who had been making North Atlantic crossings for decades and who was on his final voyage before retirement, had been rewarded throughout his career for operating within this culture. The night of April 14 was the night the culture finally produced the outcome that it had always been risking. The watertight compartment system that was supposed to keep the ship afloat failed not because it was poorly designed, but because the specific geometry of the iceberg damage exceeded its design parameters in a way that the designers had considered unlikely rather than impossible. The ship could survive with 4 compartments flooded. The iceberg opened 5. The difference between surviving and sinking was a single compartment, and the margin between the disaster that happened and the disaster that was avoided was so small that the ship's chief designer, Thomas Andrews, understood within approximately an hour of the collision that the ship had perhaps 2 hours to live. He communicated this to Captain Smith. Smith communicated it to the officers responsible for the evacuation. The evacuation began, and then the next layer of failure began alongside it. The lifeboats were lowered beginning at approximately 12:45 a.m., roughly an hour after the collision, and the pattern of how they were loaded contains within it a complete record of everything wrong with the night's management. The first lifeboats to be lowered in the early stages of the evacuation, when the ship's list was still slight, and many passengers still did not believe the ship was in genuine danger, went over the side significantly less than full. Lifeboat 7, the first away, carried approximately 28 people in a boat designed for 65. Lifeboat 6 carried approximately 28 inches, a boat designed for 65. The officers directing the loading were not cavalier about the lives of the people they were sending away. They were operating in conditions of genuine uncertainty, uncertain whether the davit equipment could safely handle a fully loaded boat on the way down, uncertain whether the ship's list would worsen before the boats could be retrieved, uncertain about a situation that their training had not specifically prepared them for, and they were making conservative decisions in that uncertainty that had the effect of sending boats away with space that could have held people, who would later die in the water. As the night progressed and the ship's angle steepened and the reality of what was happening became impossible for anyone on the boat deck to deny, the loading became more urgent and more chaotic. The last boats to go were overloaded. By then, the first boats were already a quarter-mile away in the dark, and the officers who had sent them away with empty seats did not have the communication system or the physical means to call them back and fill them. The temperature of the water that night was approximately 28 degrees Fahrenheit, just below freezing, cold enough to kill an unprotected person through cardiac arrest or loss of muscle control in somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes. This was the reality that the 1,500 people who went into the water when the ship sank were confronting, and it is the reality that gives the emptied lifeboats their particular moral weight. There were approximately 400 to 500 empty seats in the lifeboats that rowed away from the Titanic that night. There were 1,500 people in the water. The math does not resolve into simple accountability. The seats that went empty in the early boats were not the seats of specific people who were then denied them, but the broader truth is clear enough. The people who directed the evacuation did not fill the boats, and people died in numbers that a better managed evacuation could have reduced, and the investigations that followed spent considerable energy examining exactly why the boats were not filled, without ever quite producing the full reckoning that the question deserved. What the night of April 14 to 15, 1912 actually was stripped of the legend, and the romance and the century of cultural processing was a system's failure of extraordinary completeness. Every layer of protection that should have prevented the disaster failed in sequence. The ice warnings were not acted on, the speed was not reduced, the watertight system was not equal to the damage. The evacuation was not organized with sufficient coordination. The lifeboats were not filled to capacity. The nearby ship that could have arrived in time did not come. Each individual failure was the product of specific decisions made by specific people, operating within a specific set of institutional constraints and cultural assumptions that made the decisions seem reasonable at the time. The disaster was not an act of God or a freak of nature. It was the outcome of a system that had never been tested at full scale, and that, when tested, revealed that its actual safety properties were substantially less than its advertised safety properties. Understanding that is not about assigning blame to individuals. It is about understanding why the disaster happened, and why, without the changes it forced into existence, it would have happened again. The ship went down at 2:20 a.m. The people in the water died in the minutes that followed. The people in the lifeboats watched from a distance in the cold and the dark, and some of them would spend the rest of their lives not being able to fully explain why the boats did not go back. The Carpathia was already running toward them through the ice, but it would not arrive for another hour and 40 minutes, and in that time, the water did what water at 28 degrees Fahrenheit does to an unprotected human body. At 12:20 a.m., on the 15th of April, 1912, the wireless operator aboard the RMS Carpathia received the Titanic's distress signal. The Carpathia was 58 miles away, sailing in the opposite direction, carrying 743 passengers on a routine voyage to the Mediterranean. Its captain, Arthur Rostron, was asleep in his cabin. He was woken immediately, and what followed in the next few minutes, the decisions he made while still processing the information that the largest ship in the world was sinking, and that his was the closest vessel that could help represent one of the Paradis. Most remarkable examples of clear-headed emergency response in maritime history. Rostron turned his ship around, He ordered every ounce of steam the boilers could produce, redirected to the engines, pulling heat from the passenger heating system and the hot water supply to push the ship to speeds it was not technically rated to achieve. He organized his crew and his ship's medical staff and his passenger volunteers for the reception of survivors before his ship had reached the position where the survivors would be. He posted extra lookouts for ice, because the route he was taking, at the speed he was taking it, through waters he knew were dangerous, was the kind of route that captains did not normally take. He took it anyway. He arrived at 4:10 a.m., 1 hour and 40 minutes after the Titanic had gone under, and found the lifeboats scattered across a debris field in the pre-dawn darkness of the North Atlantic, and began the process of pulling 710 people out of the boats and up the side of his ship, with the efficiency and a care that said everything about what kind of officer he was and what kind of night everyone around him had just survived. The survivors who came aboard the Carpathia that morning were not the people they had been 24 hours earlier, and most of them would never fully become those people again. The psychological damage of what they had experienced, the sound of the ship's hull groaning in the water the moment the lights went out, the voices of the people in the water calling for help and then going quiet, was total in the specific way that the trauma of mass death is total for the people who survive it, while others do not. Many survivors would not speak of what they had witnessed for years. Some never spoke of it at all. The concept of post-traumatic stress did not exist as a clinical category in 1912, and the support structures available to people processing the kind of extreme psychological damage the Titanic survivors were carrying were essentially non-existent. They were expected to recover. Many of them recovered in the external, functional sense. They returned to their lives. They worked. They appeared in public. They did the things that people in their social positions were expected to do. What was happening underneath that surface was, for many of them, something that the era they lived in had no language for and no treatment for and no real acknowledgement of. The Carpathia docked in New York on the night of April 18, 3.5 days after the sinking, in conditions that no one involved had arranged for and that the city had no framework to manage. 30,000 people were at the pier. The press was there in numbers that turned the arrival into something between a news event and an ambush. The White Star Line representatives who met the ship were operating without adequate information, without adequate resources, and without anything approaching an adequate plan for the human reality of what was coming off the gangway. 710 people, in various states of shock and grief and physical exhaustion, many of them without money, without identification documents, without any clear plan for what happened next, stepping into a crowd and a chaos that the city had not prepared for because no one had anticipated that it was necessary to prepare. The wealthy first-class survivors were met by family members and representatives of the social networks that cushion the powerful from the sharp edges of disaster. The third-class survivors, largely, were not. Many of them were processed through the immigration system. That was the routine next step for anyone arriving in America in steerage, the same system they would have gone through if the ship had arrived normally. Now applied to people who had just watched their fellow passengers drown. The information management of the days between the sinking and the Carpathia's arrival had been so poor that the public who received the survivors had spent those days in a state of uncertainty and then sudden devastating clarity that had already shaped how they would receive the story before the survivors could tell it. The White Star Line's initial reluctance to confirm the sinking, motivated partly by genuine uncertainty from confused early reports, and partly by the institutional instinct of a corporation confronting the worst disaster in its history, had created a vacuum that the press filled with speculation, some of it accurate and some of it wildly wrong. For a period of hours, newspapers ran headlines suggesting that the Titanic had been damaged but was being towed to port, that all passengers had been safely transferred to other ships, that the disaster was serious but manageable. When the truth arrived that the ship was gone, that over 1,500 people were dead, that the women and children of third class had died in proportions that directly contradicted the evacuation protocol that was supposed to protect them. The public grief was compounded by the anger of people who felt they had been misled, even when the misleading had been partly the product of genuine confusion rather than deliberate concealment. The 710 survivors sorted themselves, in the weeks and months that followed, into those whose stories the public wanted to hear, and those whose stories disappeared into the ordinary silence that has always surrounded the experience of people without social power. The wealthy widows of first class became the public face of survivor grief, their names already known, their losses acknowledged as significant by the social world they occupied, their accounts of the night solicited by journalists who could speak their language and print their words in newspapers that their social peers read. The immigrants of third class who had survived became, for the most part, invisible in the historical record almost immediately, their languages unrecorded by American journalists, their experiences unasked for by investigations, more interested in the decisions of officers and executives than in the experience of the people who had been most thoroughly failed by the systems responsible for their safety. That invisibility was not incidental. It was the social structure of the disaster, reproducing itself in the social structure of how the disaster was remembered. What happened to the people on that ship was not equal. What happened to their stories afterward was not equal either. The investigations that began almost immediately after the Carpathia docked were aimed at producing accountability for the specific decisions that had produced the disaster. What they actually produced was something considerably more complicated, a record of the truth, carefully managed, strategically incomplete, and shaped at every level by the interests of people who had much to lose from full disclosure and the means to protect themselves from it. Senator William Alden Smith had never commanded a ship. He had never navigated the North Atlantic. He did not know the technical vocabulary of maritime operations, and the witnesses he questioned during the American inquiry into the Titanic disaster made sure, in their responses, that his lack of expertise was visible. When Smith asked questions about the behavior of a ship's compartments that revealed imprecise understanding of the engineering involved, the White Star Line's technical representatives answered with a precision calibrated to demonstrate his ignorance rather than to produce clarity. It was a strategy not unique to this particular inquiry, not unique to this particular era of using the appearance of expertise to manage the boundaries of what an investigation could actually reach. What the witnesses did not fully account for was that Smith did not need to understand maritime engineering. He understood politics. He understood that a disaster of this scale, in an era when the relationship between corporations and the governments that were supposed to regulate them was one of the central political questions of the day, was an event that could either produce genuine accountability or produce the performance of accountability while the actual questions went unanswered. He had been in politics long enough to know the difference. He was determined, with a stubbornness that his critics mistook for ignorance and his supporters recognized as something more useful, not to allow the performance to substitute for the substance. The American inquiry moved faster than anyone in the shipping industry had anticipated or desired. Within hours of the Carpathia's docking in New York on April 18, Smith had subpoenas served on the key witnesses he needed, including J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, who had been intending to return to Britain on the first available ship, and who would, if he reached British soil, be beyond the jurisdiction of any American inquiry. The speed of the move was not accidental. Smith understood that the institutional interest of every major figure connected to the White Star Line was to return to Britain, where the inquiry would be conducted with considerably more deference to the shipping industry's concerns, where the witnesses could coordinate their testimony with greater leisure, and where the specific questions that an American senator with an angry American public behind him was likely to ask would not be asked with the same persistence. By serving the subpoenas immediately, before Ismay and the other White Star officials could board their ships, Smith established the terms of engagement. This investigation would happen on American terms, at American speed, with American witnesses who could not coordinate their departure from the jurisdiction. What the American inquiry actually produced, across its 18 days of hearings and its testimony from 82 witnesses, was a record that contained genuine and important truths, alongside careful evasions that the political and legal limits of the inquiry could not penetrate. Smith established clearly that the ice warnings had been received and not acted upon, that the ship had been traveling at or near its maximum speed through waters known to be dangerous, and that the lifeboat provision was dramatically inadequate relative to the number of people the ship was carrying. He documented, through witness testimony, the specific procedural failures of the evacuation, the boats launched less than full, the communication failures between officers on different parts of the ship, the absence of any organized plan for a mass evacuation that the crew had never specifically trained to execute. These were real findings, with real implications. They were also findings that the White Star Line and the witnesses who represented its interests managed, through careful testimony, to frame as human errors and unprecedented circumstances rather than as the predictable consequences of systemic choices that the company had made over years. Lord Mersey's British inquiry, which ran from May to July 1912 and heard testimony from 96 witnesses, was a more professionally conducted investigation in the technical sense and a more thoroughly managed one in the political sense. Mersey was a senior admiralty judge whose social world overlapped significantly with the worlds of the shipping industry executives whose decisions were being examined. The panel that conducted the inquiry included shipping industry representatives. The atmosphere of the proceedings was one in which the institutional respect for British maritime tradition, which was, in practice, the tradition that had produced the specific practices that allowed the disaster to happen, shaped the questions that were asked and the weight that was given to the answers. The inquiry's conclusion that Captain Smith had behaved in accordance with the normal practices of the industry was accurate. The inquiry's implicit suggestion that this conclusion absolved the industry of responsibility for those practices was not. The practices had killed 1,517 people. The fact that the practices were normal was not exculpatory. It was, if anything, more damning, because it meant that the disaster was not a freak accident, but the predictable outcome of a system that had been operating at dangerous risk levels for years and had simply not yet produced a catastrophe visible enough to force a reckoning. The specific finding that the White Star Line had not been negligent in its lifeboat provision because it exceeded the legal requirements is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the finding that most clearly reveals what the British inquiry was actually doing. The Titanic carried more lifeboats than British law required for a ship of its size. This was true. The law required lifeboats for approximately 962 people on a ship carrying 2,224. The Titanic's lifeboats, if fully loaded, could have carried approximately 1,178. The White Star Line had gone beyond the legal minimum. What the inquiry's favourable treatment of this fact glossed over was the question that the fact most urgently raises, not whether the White Star Line had followed the law, but whether the law was adequate. It was not adequate. It was demonstrably, catastrophically inadequate, and the inadequacy was not a secret. The Board of Trade Regulations had last been comprehensively updated in 1894, when ships were significantly smaller. The shipping industry had lobbied successfully, in the intervening years, against updating regulations that would have required more lifeboats on the larger ships that were being built. The regulatory gap that allowed a ship carrying 2,224 people to sail legally with lifeboats for fewer than half of them was not an oversight. It was the outcome of a sustained and successful industry effort to keep the regulations from keeping pace with the ships. Mersey's inquiry examined the regulations, noted their inadequacy, and recommended they be changed. It did not examine why they had been allowed to remain inadequate for so long, or what role the industry's political influence had played in that outcome. The truth that both investigations circled without reaching was not complicated. It was simply this: the Titanic disaster was not primarily the result of unusual circumstances, individual failures, or bad luck with an iceberg in the dark. It was the result of a system of commercial incentives, regulatory capture, cultural assumptions about risk, and the political relationships between corporations and governments that had been producing the conditions for exactly this kind of disaster for years. The specific disaster that happened on the 14th of April 1912 could have been prevented at any of a dozen points. The type of disaster, a large ship sinking with insufficient lifeboats after ice warnings were ignored by a vessel running at full speed, was entirely predictable given the system that produced it. Both investigations knew this. Neither said it clearly. The people with the most to lose from clarity had ensured, with the patient, institutional thoroughness of the genuinely powerful, that clarity was not what the inquiries would produce. The most visible individual target of the public's need for someone to blame was not a regulatory agency or a corporate policy or a government that had failed to update a law. It was a man, a specific man, with a name and a face, and the misfortune of having survived when 1,500 others had not, and what happened to him in the years that followed the disaster, said something important about how the era processed catastrophe and who it chose to hold responsible for it. Every disaster of sufficient scale produces a villain, not because every disaster has one in the sense of a single person whose deliberate choices caused everything that followed, but because the human mind, confronted with catastrophe too large and too systemic to hold all at once, reaches instinctively for a face, a name, a specific person whose specific failure can stand in for the full complexity of what actually went wrong, and against whom the grief and the anger that cannot be directed at a regulatory system or an industrial culture, or the accumulated small decisions of 100 people over many years, can be aimed with the satisfying precision of individual blame. J. Bruce Ismay was that person for the Titanic disaster, and what was done to him in the months and years after the 14th of April 1912, not by the iceberg, not by the cold water, but by the newspapers and the public and the moral judgment of a society that needed someone to hold responsible, was a process so thorough and so effective that it reduced a complicated human being to a symbol and left the symbol in place long after the complications that made the real person visible had been discarded. Ismay was 50 years old on the night the Titanic sank, the son of the man who had founded the White Star Line and the inheritor of a business he had spent his professional life managing, with the particular combination of commercial aggression and institutional pride that the transatlantic shipping industry demanded of its leaders. He was on the maiden voyage of the Titanic, because being on the maiden voyage of his company's most important ship was what the chairman of the White Star Line did. It was a demonstration of confidence, a piece of corporate theatre, a signal to the market and the press that the company believed in what it had built. He was not the captain. He had no formal authority over the ship's operation. He was a passenger with an exceptional suite and an exceptional understanding of what the ship represented commercially. But his presence on the bridge on the afternoon of April 14, where multiple witnesses placed him in conversation with Captain Smith in the hours before the collision, raises questions about whether his informal influence over the voyage's pace was exercised in ways that contributed to the decision to maintain speed through waters known to be dangerous. These questions were examined at the inquiries. They were not definitively answered. The honest position is that the evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive, and that the full truth of what was said between Ismay and Smith in those conversations is not recoverable. What is recoverable is what Ismay did during the evacuation, and it is considerably more ambiguous than the press narrative that followed required it to be. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Ismay was on the starboard boat deck during the loading of the lifeboats, actively helping passengers into the boats, working alongside the officers conducting the evacuation, rather than observing from a position of privileged distance. He was not, by the account of anyone who saw him during this period, behaving like a man who was calculating his own survival at the expense of others. He was behaving like a man who understood the severity of what was happening and was trying, within the constraints of his position and authority, to help. When the last lifeboat on the starboard side collapsible sea was being lowered, Ismay stepped into it. The boat had empty space. No passenger was displaced by his entry. He was, at that moment, making the same calculation that every person in a life-threatening situation makes the calculation that surviving is preferable to dying, and he was making it in circumstances where the practical effect of his survival on anyone else's survival was zero. The press did not tell it this way. William Randolph Hearst's newspapers, which were at that moment engaged in the circulation competition that shaped so much of American public discourse in the early 20th century, required a story of the scale that the Titanic sinking represented to have a villain of proportional prominence. Hearst's papers called Ismay a coward. They published cartoons of him stepping over drowning women to reach a lifeboat, images that had no factual basis, and that the cartoonists who drew them knew had no factual basis. They gave him a nickname, J. Brute Ismay, that was designed to be repeated and was. The narrative they constructed had the specific quality of effective propaganda. It was simple, emotionally resonant, directed at a target who was already socially vulnerable in the specific way that the representative of a corporation whose product had just killed 1,517 people was vulnerable, and it was repeated loudly and consistently enough that the questions about its accuracy were drowned out before they could be properly asked. The truth about what Ismay had and had not done on the night of April 14 was available. It was in the testimony at both inquiries. It was in the accounts of witnesses who had been on the boat deck with him. But the truth was complicated, and complications do not sell newspapers in the same way that a clear villain does. The specific cruelty of what happened to Ismay lies not in the fact that he was criticized. There are legitimate criticisms of his role in creating the culture and the commercial pressures that contributed to the disaster, though they require nuance that the era's press was not interested in providing, but in the thoroughness with which those criticisms were replaced by a fictional version of him that bore only a passing relationship to the person who had actually been on the ship, the man who had helped load passengers into lifeboats and then stepped into a boat with empty space was erased and replaced by a coward who had used his power to save himself while others died. That fictional Ismay was more useful to the public's emotional needs than the real one, and the fictional Ismay was what survived. He resigned from the White Star Line within months. He largely withdrew from public life. He spent the last 25 years of his existence in a quiet semi-retirement in Ireland that his critics interpreted as further evidence of shame, and that may simply have been the response of a man who had survived something devastating, and then been told, repeatedly and publicly, that surviving it was itself a crime. He died in 1937, having never given a major public interview about the disaster, having never publicly challenged the narrative that had destroyed his reputation, carrying whatever the truth of his inner experience of that night actually was, to a grave that the history books mark only with the symbol they made of him. The technology that might have saved everyone on the Titanic that was present, that was functioning, that connected ships across hundreds of miles of open ocean was used that night in ways that turned a tool of rescue into a record of missed opportunities. The story of the wireless operators and the ships within range is one of the least comfortable chapters of the entire disaster, because it is the chapter where the gap between what was possible and what actually happened is smallest, and therefore most painful to examine. In April 1912, wireless telegraphy was 14 years old as a practical technology, and approximately 7 years old as a feature of ocean liner service. It was, in the understanding of the shipping companies that installed it, a commercial amenity, a way for wealthy passengers to stay connected to their businesses and their social lives during the days they spent out of reach of the land-based telegraph network. The Marconi Company, which held the dominant position in maritime wireless, and which employed the operators on ships, including the Titanic, under a contract arrangement that made those operators Marconi employees rather than ship's officers, had built its business model on this commercial understanding. The revenue came from passenger messages. The operators were employed to send and receive passenger messages. The ice warnings and weather reports and other ship-to-ship communications that traveled across the same wavelengths were, in the operational culture of 1912 maritime wireless, secondary to the commercial traffic, not unimportant, not deliberately ignored, but occupying a lower position in the practical hierarchy of what the operators were there to do. That hierarchy was about to be tested by a night that would reveal, with a completeness that no subsequent argument could diminish, how catastrophically wrong the hierarchy had been built. Jack Phillips, the senior wireless operator aboard the Titanic, was 25 years old on the night of the 14th of April, 1912. He had been a Marconi operator for several years, was regarded as competent and professional by the standards of his field, and had spent the evening of April 14 working through a substantial backlog of passenger messages that had accumulated because the wireless equipment had been out of service for a period the previous day. The backlog was commercial traffic, the greetings and business communications and social messages of the first-class passengers who were the primary users of the wireless service and clearing. It was his job, in the most farthing, direct, practical sense. It was what he was employed to do, and what the Marconi Company measured his performance against. The ice warnings that arrived during the day from other ships in the area were handled as they came in, acknowledged, logged, passed to the bridge through the appropriate channels, but they were not the primary business of the wireless room, and when the volume of passenger traffic was high, they received correspondingly less attention. This was not negligence in the individual sense. It was the operational expression of a system in which safety communication had never been formally prioritized over commercial communication, because no one with the authority to make that prioritization had yet done so. The Californian was a medium-sized cargo and passenger ship that had stopped for the night in the ice field that the Titanic was crossing, its captain having decided in a judgment that the events of the next few hours would render bitterly ironic that proceeding through ice in the dark was too dangerous. The ship was stopped, its engines quiet, its wireless equipment attended by a single operator named Cyril Evans. At approximately 11 p.m., Evans attempted to contact the Titanic with an ice warning, a message that began with the informal wireless shorthand for a station transmitting at close range, which in this case meant very close range, because the Californian was approximately 20 miles away. The signal arrived in Phillips's headphones at a volume that physically hurt, because 20 miles in wireless terms was almost adjacently close, and the strength of the signal reflected that proximity. Phillips, in the middle of managing the passenger message backlog, told Evans to stand by the wireless equivalent of asking someone to wait. Evans waited for a few minutes and then, his shift ending and having received no further response, shut down his equipment and went to bed. 22 minutes after that exchange, the Titanic hit the iceberg. The Californian was 20 miles away, close enough, at the speeds both ships were capable of, to have arrived at the Titanic's position before the ship went under. Its wireless was off. Its operator was asleep. What happened aboard the Californian in the hours that followed is one of the most thoroughly examined and most persistently contested questions in the entire history of the disaster. The Californian's officers saw, during the night, the lights of a ship in the distance, and then observed rockets being fired from that ship, white rockets, fired at intervals, which, in the Maritime Convention of 1912, were an unambiguous distress signal. They reported what they saw to Captain Stanley Lord, who was resting in the chart room. Lord was informed of the rockets. He asked whether they were company signals, a legitimate question, since some shipping companies used rockets as identification signals, and when told they did not appear to be, he gave instructions that the ship that was firing them should be contacted by Morse lamp. The Morse lamp contact produced no clear response. Lord went back to his rest. The rockets continued. No one woke the wireless operator. The Californian did not move toward the ship that was firing distress signals into the dark until morning, when Evans switched on his equipment, heard the news of the Titanic's sinking from other ships in the area, and reported it to the captain. Lord then proceeded to the location, arriving after the Carpathia had already taken the survivors aboard. Whether Captain Lord understood that the rockets he was told about were distress signals from a ship in genuine emergency, whether his decision not to respond was the result of genuine uncertainty, of incomplete information reaching him through tired officers in the middle of the night, or of something more deliberate, that no investigation has been able to definitively establish, is a question that maritime historians have been arguing about for more than a century without reaching consensus. What is not arguable is the arithmetic. The Californian could have reached the Titanic before it sank. It did not try. 1,500 people died in the water while a ship that could have saved them stopped in the ice 20 miles away, with its wireless off and its captain resting. The Radio Act of 1912, passed by the United States Congress within months of the disaster, was the most immediate legislative response to the wireless failures of the night, a direct acknowledgement that the technology whose mismanagement had contributed to the scale of the disaster needed to be brought under regulatory control before the same failures could happen again. The act required ships of a certain size to maintain 24-hour wireless watches, established a dedicated international distress frequency that was to be kept clear of all other traffic at all times, and formally required that wireless communication be understood and operated as a safety system rather than a commercial convenience. The principle that the Act established that a ship's wireless operators were performing a safety function whose requirements superseded any commercial considerations was simple, obvious in retrospect, and had apparently needed 1,517 deaths to make it visible to the people with the authority to act on it. The regulatory response to the disaster addressed the technical failures of the wireless system with speed and relative effectiveness. The human failures, the patterns of survival and death that the disaster had produced, The specific ways in which the social structure of the ship had shaped who got into the lifeboats and who went into the water were examined in the inquiries, and then, for the most part, quietly set aside. The numbers told a story that the era was not ready to fully confront. The numbers are simple. They are also, if you look at them directly without the softening that a century of cultural processing has applied to them, among the most morally uncomfortable facts in the entire history of the disaster. 60 to 63% of first-class passengers survived the sinking of the Titanic. 42 to 43% of second-class passengers survived. 25% of third-class passengers survived. These numbers were available to both official inquiries. They were reported in the press. They were discussed in public. And then, for the most part, they were absorbed into the broader narrative of the disaster as a tragedy that had affected everyone, in which the distinction between the people who got into the lifeboats and the people who went into the water was attributed to the chaos and the darkness and the insufficient time available, rather than to the specific social architecture of a ship that had been built to make certain people's lives more comfortable and had, in the process, built those same people much closer to the exits, when the exits became the only thing that mattered. The physical layout of the Titanic was not designed with evacuation in mind. It was designed with the passenger experience in mind, which meant, in the commercial logic of 1912 ocean travel, that the first-class accommodations were located on the upper decks, close to the open air and the social spaces and the promenade areas that were the primary features of the first-class experience. The boat deck, where the lifeboats were housed, was directly accessible from the first-class sections of the ship. A first-class passenger who woke up after the collision and decided to go to the boat deck to see what was happening had a short, unobstructed walk on familiar territory. A third-class passenger who woke up after the collision and tried to reach the boat deck faced a journey through multiple levels of the ship, through passageways that were not clearly marked for emergency use, past barriers that were normally locked, in a section of the ship they had not been permitted to explore during the voyage, and whose geography was therefore unfamiliar. The physical distance between where third-class passengers slept and where the lifeboats were was not enormous in absolute terms. In the specific conditions of that night, the darkness, the unfamiliar layout, the confusion, the language barriers, the barriers that separated the classes, it was sufficient to be fatal for a significant proportion of the people who were trying to cross it. The locked gates deserve sustained attention rather than the brief acknowledgement they typically receive in the standard accounts of the disaster. The gates existed because American immigration law required that third-class passengers be kept separate from other classes during a transatlantic voyage, a requirement rooted in concerns about the spread of infectious disease. From immigrant populations, applying the public health logic of Ellis Island to the ship that was carrying people to it. The people who designed this requirement and the shipping companies that implemented it had not specifically thought about what would happen to the people behind the gates if the ship they were traveling on sank. This was not deliberate cruelty. It was something potentially worse, a complete absence of thought about the safety implications of a structural arrangement that prioritized immigration compliance over the physical survival of the people being complied against. During the evacuation, the gates were opened. But the timeline of when specific gates were opened, by which crew members, with what communication to the passengers on the other side, was inconsistent across different parts of the ship. Some gates were opened early, others were opened late. Some may not have been opened at all until the passengers on the other side found ways around them. The result was that the barrier between third class and the boat deck, which had been a mundane feature of normal shipboard life, became, in the specific emergency conditions of April 14 to 15, 1912, a factor in the survival calculations of people who had never been told it would matter. The third-class passengers who survived did so, for the most part, through a combination of individual initiative, proximity to crew members who directed them upward, and the specific geography of their cabin assignments within the third-class sections of the ship. Those who were in the stern third-class sections furthest from the bow, where the flooding was most advanced, had more time. Those who were in the forward sections had less. Those who spoke English, or who encountered crew members who spoke their language, had access to instructions that those who did not were navigating without. A third-class passenger from County Mayo who spoke English and who happened to be near a crew member who was directing passengers toward the boat deck had a meaningfully different chance of survival than a third-class passenger from Poland or Syria who spoke no English and who encountered no one willing to physically guide them through the ship's unfamiliar upper decks. The chaos was real. The darkness was real. The time pressure was real. None of these facts changed the underlying structure of who had advantages and who did not. And the advantages mapped precisely onto the class hierarchy that the ship had been built to express and maintain. The dead of third class were, as a demographic group, the hardest people on the ship to document in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. The first-class dead were identified within days their names were known. Their faces were recognizable to the journalists covering the story. Their families had the resources and the social connections to pursue identification and death certificates and legal claims through the systems that existed to process them. The third-class dead included hundreds of people who were making one-way journeys to a new country, who had left their home countries with documents that remained in those home countries or had been lost in the sinking, whose families were in Ireland or Scandinavia or Lebanon or Poland, and had no direct way to communicate their loss or confirm their loved one's death to the American authorities processing the disaster's aftermath. Many of them were listed on the passenger manifest under names that had been anglicized at the point of embarkation, making the connection between the listed name and the actual person difficult to establish even when both records existed. Some of them were not on the manifest at all, traveling under arrangements that the official record did not capture. The work of recovering their names and their stories from historical obscurity has been conducted over decades by researchers who understood that the history of the Titanic as it was being written was the history of the people whose stories the era had found convenient to record, and that the full history required going back to the sources the era had not consulted. It is not finished. There are third-class passengers whose names are still uncertain, whose lives before the ship are still largely undocumented, whose deaths are still marked only by their absence from the records of countries they were trying to reach. They died in the water in the dark, without names that the newspapers printed, without faces that the cameras recorded, without stories that the public narrative found space for. They were the people the ship had been least designed to serve, and most effectively failed. The families they left behind on both sides of the ocean, in the countries they had come from, and in the country they had been trying to reach, faced the aftermath of the disaster, with a grief that the legal and financial systems of the time were almost entirely unprepared to address. What those systems offered the bereaved was, in most cases, a fraction of what had been lost, administered with a bureaucratic thoroughness that was in sharp contrast to the human scale of what was being compensated for. The ocean does not return what it takes. This is a fact that every maritime culture has understood for as long as people have been going to sea, and the families of people who die on ships have always known, at some level, that the body they might bury would not always be recoverable. But knowing this in the abstract, and living with it in the specific, are different experiences, and the families of the Titanic's dead were living with it in the specific, in the daily, particular reality of a person who had left home and had not come back, whose death was documented by official records and newspaper accounts and the testimony of survivors, but whose physical absence from the world had not been confirmed by the presence of a body, a coffin, a grave with a specific location where the grief could be brought and set down. For most of the 1,517 people who died when the Titanic sank, no such grave existed. They were simply gone removed from the world by cold water and darkness, present in the official record as names on a list, absent from every place where the people who loved them had expected them to return. The recovery operation that began in the weeks after the sinking was conducted by 4 ships dispatched from Halifax, Nova Scotia, chosen because Halifax was the nearest major port with the facilities to process and store bodies recovered from the North Atlantic. The ships worked the debris field and the surrounding area for weeks, and they recovered 340 bodies. The number is significant not only for what it represents, 340 people pulled from the ocean and returned to the possibility of identification and burial, but for what it does not represent. 1,177 people were not recovered. They went down with the ship, or they drifted in the current beyond the search area, or they were in the water long enough that what remained of them was unrecoverable. Of the 340 that were found, 119 were in such poor condition after days in the cold ocean that the ship's doctors determined they could not be transported back to land without further deterioration that would make identification impossible. These 119 were buried at sea, a second ocean burial, conducted with more ceremony than the first, but equally final in its effect, which was that the families of those people would have no physical confirmation of death and no grave to visit. The 209 bodies brought to Halifax were processed through a temporary morgue established in a curling rink, where a team of embalmers and medical personnel, and the clerks necessary to establish official identification, worked through the bodies, with the specific combination of professional detachment and human weight that this kind of work requires. Personal effects were catalogued: clothing, jewelry, wallets, pocket watches, letters, the accumulated small items that people carry on their persons, and that in this context became the primary evidence of who someone was. Physical characteristics were recorded. Photographs were taken where photographs could be taken. The work was careful and as thorough as the technology of the time allowed, and it produced identifications for most of the 209, which were then used to notify families and to facilitate the return of bodies to those families where families could be reached and where the cost of transportation could be managed. The bodies that could not be identified, or whose families could not be located or could not afford to claim them, were buried in 3 Halifax cemeteries: the Fairview Lawn Cemetery, the Mount Olivet Cemetery, and the Baron de Hirsch Cemetery, in graves that were marked with names where names were known and with numbers where they were not. Among the numbered graves, the graves of people who died without being identified, one became, in the decades that followed, the site of a particular and collective grief that extended far beyond the specific person buried there. The body of a young child, a boy estimated to be somewhere between 1 and 2 years old, was found floating in the ocean, wearing a second-class coat and small brown shoes. No one on the recovered passenger list could be definitively matched to him. No family came forward to claim him. He was buried in Fairview Lawn Cemetery under a stone that said simply, "Unknown Child." For decades, that grave received more flowers and more visitors than almost any other grave in the cemetery, because the parents who had lost young children in the disaster, whose children had not been recovered, who had no grave of their own to visit, found in this particular unnamed grave a focus for a grief that had nowhere else to be placed. The child was eventually identified in 2007 through DNA analysis as Sidney Leslie Goodwin, a 19-month-old English boy traveling in 3rd class with his entire family, all 6 of whom died. The identification gave him his name back. It did not change what the grave had meant to the people who had been visiting it for 95 years, which was something simpler and more human than any specific identity could provide, a place to put the grief for a child who had died in the water before anyone understood what was happening. The financial settlement that followed the disaster was a legal and moral failure of a completeness that the subsequent century has not always been willing to name clearly. The White Star Line, operating under American maritime liability law that had been written in an era of much smaller ships and much simpler accidents, settled the totality of claims arising from the disaster. Thousands of individual claims representing the deaths of 1,517 people, and the loss of their income, their labor, their support, and their future for approximately $664,000. The individual amounts paid to individual claimants varied enormously according to the social position of the claimant and their ability to pursue their claim through a legal system that rewarded resources and penalized their absence. The widow of a wealthy first-class passenger who had retained legal counsel and who had the social network to navigate the American court system received a settlement that, while falling far short of the actual economic value of her loss, was at least legible as an attempt at compensation. The widow of a third-class steerage passenger, a woman who might be in a new country, without English, without legal resources, without the social connections that translate into advocacy in a court system that serves those who can afford it, received a portion of the general settlement that was, in many cases, so small as to be an insult rather than a compensation. The legal structure of the settlement reflected, with the same precision that the lifeboat survival statistics had reflected, the social structure of the disaster. The The people with the most resources received the most from the system that processed their loss, and the people with the least received the least. And the gap between the two was wide enough that it is more accurate to say the system served one group and failed the other than to say it served everyone inadequately. What the families of the dead were left with, across all classes and all nationalities, was grief in a form that the era was poorly equipped to support. The concept of what is now called complicated grief, the specific psychological difficulty of mourning someone whose death cannot be confirmed by a body, whose absence cannot be made concrete in the way that a death in normal circumstances is made concrete, was not a clinical category. In 1912, the bereaved were expected to grieve and then to stop grieving, on a timeline that bore no relationship to what they were actually experiencing. Many of them never stopped. The legal system that had so inadequately compensated the disaster's bereaved would, in the years immediately following, be forced into reform by a public and political pressure that the scale of the disaster had made impossible to ignore. The Titanic did not just kill people. It exposed the gap between the promises of the regulatory state and its actual performance, and that exposure produced changes that are still operating today. There is a specific kind of political moment that only a disaster of sufficient scale can create a moment in which the gap between what the public has been promised and what has actually been delivered becomes so visible, so undeniable, and so emotionally overwhelming that the normal mechanisms of institutional self-protection fail to operate. The lobbying that keeps regulations from being updated, the industry relationships that soften the edges of government oversight, the bureaucratic inertia that allows inadequate standards to persist year after year simply because no one with the authority to change them has been sufficiently motivated to do so. All of these mechanisms, which had been operating effectively in the maritime shipping industry for decades, stopped working in the weeks after the Titanic sank. They stopped working because 1,517 people were dead, because the newspapers were full of the names of those dead, because the public had been told that the ship was practically unsinkable, and now understood with complete clarity what that promise had actually been worth. In that specific moment of clarity, legislation that had been technically possible for years and politically impossible for months became not just possible, but inevitable. The question was not whether the law would change. The question was how much it would change and how quickly. The lifeboat requirement was the most immediately obvious target for reform, and the inadequacy of the existing standard was so complete that explaining it required revisiting decisions that the Board of Trade had been making, or failing to make, for almost 2 decades. The last comprehensive update to British lifeboat regulations before the Titanic disaster had occurred in 1894, 18 years earlier, when the largest ships in service on the North Atlantic run were substantially smaller than the vessels being built by 1912. The regulations specified the required number of lifeboats, using a formula based on gross tonnage, and the formula had been designed for the ships of 1,894. As ships grew larger in the years that followed, the formula produced numbers that did not scale proportionally with the growth, meaning that the lifeboat requirement as a percentage of passenger capacity was declining every time a larger ship entered service. No one had updated the formula. No one had been forced to. The shipping industry, which had commercial interests in minimizing the weight and deck space devoted to safety equipment, had not lobbied for an update. The Board of Trade, which was responsible for maritime safety but operated in the context of an industry relationship that was warmer than strict regulatory independence would suggest was appropriate, had not updated it independently. The formula sat untouched as the ships grew, and the gap between the capacity of the required lifeboats and the number of people the ships were carrying grew with it. By 1912, the formula required lifeboats for fewer than half the people aboard a ship of the Titanic's size. The Titanic exceeded even this inadequate requirement, and over 1,000 people drowned anyway, in water less than 2 miles deep, within radio range of ships that could have reached them and did not. The British inquiries finding that the White Star Line had not violated the lifeboat regulations, which was technically true, had the unintended but entirely predictable effect of focusing public and parliamentary attention on the regulations themselves rather than on the company. If the company had done nothing illegal and over 1,000 people had died for want of lifeboats, then the law was the problem. And unlike the company, which had lawyers and public relations resources and institutional resilience. The Board of Trade's 18-year-old formula for calculating lifeboat requirements had no defenders willing to stand in public and argue that it was adequate. The new requirement lifeboats for everyone aboard, not for a fraction of everyone aboard, not for the number that an 18-year-old formula calculated would be adequate, but for every person on the ship was passed into British maritime law within months. It was a standard so basic, so obviously appropriate, that the fact it had required 1,517 deaths to become law is one of the more precise measures of how thoroughly the regulatory system had failed in the years before the disaster. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea (SOLAS) represented a more ambitious regulatory achievement than the lifeboat requirement, because it required not just one country to change its laws, but multiple maritime nations to agree on common standards that would apply to all of their ships. International regulatory agreements of this kind were rare in 1914, when the first SOLAS Convention was adopted, and the fact that one was negotiated so quickly after the Titanic disaster reflects both the political pressure the disaster had created and the genuine understanding among maritime nations that safety standards which applied only to ships of certain nationalities were less effective than standards that applied to everyone using the same oceans. A British ship with lifeboats for everyone was safer. A British ship with lifeboats for everyone sharing the North Atlantic with American ships that had lifeboats for half their passengers was less safe than it should be, because the ships that crossed the same waters shared the same risks and the same responsibility for responding to each other's emergencies. SOLAS established the principle that maritime safety was an international obligation, and it established the specific requirements: 24-hour wireless watches, lifeboat drills, ice reporting, that were the direct legislative legacy of the specific failures of the 14th of April, 1912. The International Ice Patrol deserves particular attention because it is the most continuous and most directly traceable consequence of the disaster still operating in the present day. Established in 1914 and funded by the 17 maritime nations that use the North Atlantic shipping lanes, the patrol has monitored iceberg positions in the North Atlantic continuously since its founding, first by ships, then by aircraft, now by satellite and aerial survey, combined with a single interruption during the Second World War, when the resources needed for the work were redirected to the war itself. The patrol identifies icebergs, tracks their movement, and broadcasts their positions to all ships crossing the North Atlantic. It has never failed to warn ships about icebergs it had identified. Since its establishment, no ship that received and acted upon its warnings has struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. The icebergs are still calving from Greenland. They are still drifting south into the shipping lanes every spring. The water is still cold enough to kill in minutes. The difference between 1912 and the century that followed is not that the danger went away. The difference is that the disaster created the political will to build a system that manages the danger honestly, continuously, and without the commercial pressures that had made the management of that danger, before the 14th of April, 1912, so catastrophically inadequate. What the legislative legacy of the Titanic ultimately represents is the specific, measurable cost of allowing regulatory systems to remain inadequate, because the consequences of their inadequacy have not yet arrived in a form visible enough to demand correction. The regulations that governed the Titanic's lifeboat provision, wireless operation, and ice management were all inadequate before the ship sailed. The inadequacy was identifiable before the ship sailed. The correction of the inadequacy required only the political will to act on information that was already available. That political will was not present until 1,517 deaths made its absence impossible to sustain. The lives that have been saved since 1914 by the lifeboat requirements and the ice patrol and the wireless watches are not recorded anywhere because the disasters they prevented did not happen. They are the invisible legacy of visible catastrophe, the people who crossed the North Atlantic safely in the century after the Titanic sank, in ships that carried enough lifeboats and maintained continuous wireless watches and knew where the ice was, and arrived in port without knowing that the safety that carried them there had been purchased at an enormous price 60 or 70 or 100 years before they boarded. The ship that had made those regulations necessary lay at the bottom of the North Atlantic, undisturbed and undiscovered, for 73 years after it sank. When it was finally found, the questions that its discovery raised about memory, about obligation, about what the living owe to the dead were as complicated and as unresolved as anything else in the long aftermath of the disaster. For 73 years, the Titanic was a story without an ending. The ship had sunk, the survivors had testified, the inquiries had reported, the regulations had changed, the decades had passed. But the ship itself, the physical object whose existence had made everything else possible, and whose failure had made everything else necessary, was simply gone, in the specific way that things are gone when they sink to the bottom of the deepest ocean, which is to say, not destroyed but unreachable, present in the world but inaccessible to it, located somewhere in a patch of the North Atlantic roughly the size of a small country, at a depth that the technology of 1912 could not approach, and that the technology of subsequent decades could approach only slowly and at enormous cost. The position that the wireless operators had transmitted on the night of April 14 to 15, the position that the Carpathia had sailed toward, and the position that the subsequent inquiries had recorded, turned out to be off by approximately 13 miles, the product of a navigation calculation made under extreme pressure on a sinking ship. For 73 years, the Titanic lay on the ocean floor 13 miles from where everyone was looking. Robert Ballard was a Woods Hole oceanographer who had been interested in the Titanic wreck for years and who, in 1985, was conducting a research mission in the North Atlantic that was officially focused on deep ocean geology and was also partially funded by the United States Navy and conducted with military equipment, searching for the Titanic as a secondary objective. The Navy's interest was not in the Titanic specifically, it was in testing the Argo system's capability in deep water, and the Titanic's known approximate location provided a useful target. What Ballard found when the Argo's cameras swept across the ocean floor in the early morning hours of the 1st of September 1985 was first a boiler, a massive cylindrical object sitting upright on the sea floor, encrusted with marine growth, but recognizable in its shape to anyone who knew what a ship's boiler looked like. The people in the control room of the surface ship Canoe recognized it immediately. Ballard was called from his bunk. He came to the control room and looked at the images on the screens and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has been searching for something for years and has found it unexpectedly at the end of a long night, that the 73-year absence was over. They had found it. And in the way that finding things sometimes makes visible the obligations that not finding them had allowed to remain abstract, they also understood, almost immediately, that they had found something whose discovery raised questions they had not fully prepared to answer. The wreck lay in two major sections, the bow and the stern separated by approximately a third of a mile, with a debris field of extraordinary density spread across the ocean floor between them and beyond them in all directions. The bow section was largely intact, its forward superstructure partially collapsed, but its shape recognizable, the anchor chains still in their housings, the crow's nest from which Frederick Fleet had spotted the iceberg still attached to the foremast. The stern section was more severely damaged. The stresses of the sinking had been more violent at the stern, and was twisted and compressed in ways that made its original shape harder to read. Between them, spread across the sea floor in a pattern that reflected the physics of the sinking and the distribution of what had been inside the ship when it went down, were thousands of objects: luggage, shoes, bottles, pieces of china, a child's toy, the accumulated personal material of 2,224 lives, lying on the bottom of the ocean in the same positions they had reached when they fell from the sinking ship or floated out of the wreck in the days after the sinking. Ballard photographed and documented. He did not recover. His position, stated clearly and consistently from the beginning, was that the wreck site should be treated as a memorial, that the artifacts should remain where they lay, and that what had been found should be regarded with the same respect that is accorded to any site where large numbers of people have died. He left the wreck as he had found it. Ballard's position did not prevail. The legal framework that governed the wreck international salvage law, American federal courts, the complex and contested question of who has property rights over an abandoned vessel in international waters was not designed with memorial sites in mind. It was designed with salvage economics in mind, and the Titanic represented, to the people who understood the economics, an object of extraordinary potential commercial value. Artifacts recovered from the wreck and exhibited to the public could generate substantial revenue. They had been generating substantial interest since Ballard's discovery made the wreck's existence and location a matter of public knowledge. In the years after the discovery, expeditions by other groups recovered thousands of artifacts, and eventually, a single company, RMS Titanic Incorporated, established legal rights as salvor in possession of the wreck under American Admiralty law, giving it the exclusive right to recover artifacts and the legal responsibility for managing the site. The company conducted multiple expeditions and recovered over 5,000 objects, which have been exhibited in traveling shows seen by tens of millions of people across the world. The ethical question that Ballard had identified at the moment of discovery has never been resolved, because the values in tension are genuine and do not resolve. The families of the dead, many of them descendants rather than direct survivors, the original generation having largely passed by the time the recoveries began, were not uniformly opposed to artifact recovery. Some found in the exhibitions a form of memorial that the absence of graves had denied them. Others found the exhibition of personal effects from a site where their relatives died, without the consent of the dead or their families, profoundly disturbing. The argument that the artifacts belonged in a museum rather than on the seafloor, that they would deteriorate and be lost if left where they lay while recovery and conservation could preserve them for future generations, was a real argument made in good faith by people with genuine curatorial commitments. The counter-argument that recovering personal possessions from a gravesite for commercial exhibition is a violation of the dead, regardless of the educational value of the exhibition, was equally real and equally made in good faith. Both positions contain genuine moral weight. Neither has conclusively defeated the other. The artifacts are in exhibitions. The families are divided. The legal framework that allowed the recoveries continues to be contested by the United States and British governments, which have signed an agreement asserting the wreck's status as a memorial site that carries weight in policy terms and limited weight in salvage law. The wreck is disappearing. The iron-eating bacteria that colonized the hull within years of the sinking have been consuming the steel at a rate that has accelerated as the decades pass, and the visible deterioration between successive expeditions has been dramatic enough that researchers who study the wreck have begun describing the process of its disappearance in terms that have a specific kind of loss in them, not the loss of the disaster itself, which is documented and will remain documented, but the loss of the physical object that connects the documentation to something real. When the hull finally collapses, and the timeline is uncertain, but the outcome is not, the Titanic on the seafloor will become a debris field, indistinguishable in character from the debris field that already surrounds it. The ghost ship that Ballard's cameras captured in 1985, intact enough to be recognizable, haunting enough to have become one of the most reproduced images in the history of underwater exploration, will be gone. And the question of what the living owe to this specific place, and to the people who are in it, will become a question about memory and meaning rather than about a physical site, which is perhaps how it should always have been framed, and which is where the disaster's aftermath has always been heading. More than a century after the night it sank, the Titanic's presence in the cultural life of the English-speaking world remains so large and so persistent that the question worth asking is no longer what the disaster meant when it happened, but what it continues to mean. Now, and why it has never stopped meaning it. There is a particular category of disaster that a civilization cannot put down, not because it is the largest disaster. It is not. Not because it killed the most people. Wars and famines and epidemics have killed orders of magnitude more, and those events receive less sustained cultural attention, not more. The Titanic belongs to a smaller and stranger category. The disaster that arrives at exactly the right historical moment, in exactly the right form, with exactly the right combination of human specificity and systemic failure, to become something that the culture cannot finish processing. 110 years of books and films and exhibitions and documentaries and academic arguments and family research projects have not exhausted the Titanic's capacity to produce new things worth saying about it. That persistence is itself a fact worth examining, not a feature of the disaster's inherent magnitude, but a product of the specific relationship between what happened on April 14 to 15, 1912, and what the world that witnessed it needed to understand about itself. The Titanic happened at the precise historical apex of a specific kind of confidence. The Edwardian era in Britain and the progressive era in America shared, beneath their considerable differences, a common faith in the trajectory of technological progress, the belief that human ingenuity, applied systematically to the problems that had always afflicted human life, was in the process of solving them permanently. This faith was not unreasonable. The evidence for it was substantial. The 50 years before 1912 had produced more practical improvements in the conditions of daily life than any previous period in human history. And then, the ship that embodied that confidence that was, in its very construction, a monument to what the era believed about itself, went to the bottom of the Atlantic in 2 hours and 40 minutes, taking with it the lives of 1,517 people and a significant portion of the era's faith in its own invincibility. What makes the Titanic the beginning of the modern era's education in the limits of human control is not the scale of the disaster, but its timing. It preceded the First World War by 2 years, and the First World War would destroy the same confidence on a scale so vast that specificity was impossible. The Titanic killed 1,517 people, with names and faces and recorded histories. The war killed 17 million in ways that defied individual accounting. The Titanic, by coming first and being survivable in scale, retained the human specificity that mass catastrophe erases. You can name the Titanic's dead. You cannot name the Western Fronts. That specificity is the Titanic's most powerful legacy, and the work of recovering and maintaining it has been one of the consistent projects of the disaster's aftermath across a century. The third-class passengers whose names appeared nowhere in the initial press coverage have been documented, through decades of patient research, by scholars who understood that the history of the disaster, as it was originally written, was the history of the people the era had found convenient to record, and that a complete history required, going back to the sources the era had, not consulted. Immigration records in Ireland, Sweden, Lebanon, Poland, and a dozen other countries. Passenger manifests cross-referenced against ship records and survivor accounts. DNA analysis, applied to the Halifax graves, that gave names to people who had been buried as numbers. The process has been slow and is not finished, and it may never be entirely finished. There are people on the ship whose lives before the voyage are still almost entirely undocumented, whose deaths are still marked only by their absence from the places they were trying to reach. But the direction of the work is clear. It is the direction of insistence. Insistence that every person on the ship was a person, with a history and a future that was cut off, and that the obligation the disaster places on the living is to know who those people actually were, rather than to treat them as an undifferentiated mass of victims whose individuality is less important than the aggregate tragedy they compose. The safety legacy of the disaster is equally persistent, but considerably less visible, which is the correct fate of a safety system that is working. Nobody boards a cruise ship in the 21st century and thinks about the Titanic during the lifeboat drill. The drill happens anyway, required by international law that traces its origin directly to the specific failures of the 14th of April 1912. The radio officer on the bridge maintains a continuous watch, as required by regulations that were passed because Jack Phillips was too busy clearing passenger messages to give the Californian's ice warning the attention it deserved. The International Ice Patrol monitors the North Atlantic shipping lanes and broadcasts iceberg positions to every vessel crossing the ocean, as it has done continuously since 1914. Funded by the maritime nations that use the lanes and operated by the United States Coast Guard, the icebergs are still there. The water is still cold enough to kill in minutes. The difference is that the ships know where the ice is, and the lifeboats are sufficient for everyone aboard, and the radio watches are maintained without interruption, and the regulatory framework that governs all of this is binding on every ocean-going vessel in the world, regardless of which flag it flies. These things exist because 1,517 people died in their absence. The people who sail safely across the North Atlantic today are doing so in a world that is specifically safer than the world of April 1912. 912, and the specific source of that safety is the catastrophic demonstration of what happens when the safety is not there. The deeper lesson, the one that sits beneath the regulations and the memorial practices and the cultural attention, is about the permanent human tendency to normalize risk until the risk produces consequences that cannot be normalized. The people who decided not to reduce the Titanic's speed in iceberg-filled waters were not uniquely reckless. They were operating within a culture that had been normalizing exactly that decision for years, because the decision had been made before without producing disaster, and the absence of disaster had been interpreted as evidence of safety rather than as evidence of luck. This pattern risk normalized by the absence of consequences, confidence growing beyond the evidence that justifies it, warning signs received and not acted on, because the system's incentives reward optimism and punish caution, is not a feature of the Edwardian era. It is a feature of every era in which human beings operate complex systems under commercial or institutional pressure. The Titanic makes this pattern visible in a form that is specific enough to be understood emotionally, rather than just intellectually, with names attached to the consequences, with a night specific enough to walk through hour by hour, with decisions traceable to specific people who made them for reasons that were understandable at the time and fatal in their outcome. That emotional accessibility is why the story keeps teaching. Statistics about normalized risk do not change behavior. Stories about specific people making specific decisions that kill specific other people have a different quality. They make the abstract concrete in ways that the human mind responds to, and they make it harder to look at normalized risk in your own domain without hearing, somewhere at the back of the mind, the sound of the Titanic's hull scraping along the ice in the dark. What do you think? Could it happen again, the same confidence? The same normalization of risk? The same gap between the promises of a system's safety and the reality of what that system actually provides? The names would be different. The technology would be different. The specific domain might be different, not ocean liners, but something else, something that the current era has decided is practically safe, in waters that we have not yet been forced to reconsider. But the pattern is permanent. The assumption that this time, with these materials and these methods and these people in charge, we have finally closed the gap. That assumption has been present in every era and has been wrong in every era, and the cost of its being wrong has always been paid by the people who trusted the system rather than the people who built it. Leave your thoughts below. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who thinks the Titanic is a love story. Because the real story is 100 times more human than that, and the lesson it carries is one that the world has still not fully learned.